My brother laughed when I lost my job, saying, "I always knew you were a failure," at our mother's birthday lunch table, making a point to pay the $400 bill to show how well he was doing financially. He spent the next 30 minutes explaining how my firing was predictable since I never had a talent for business, like he did, having just bought a new BMW. 2 weeks later, his wife showed up at my door at 11 p.m. crying, with 2 suitcases. She had discovered he'd been using his corporate card to pay for his mistress's apartment for 8 months. The most ironic part is that she told me the only reason she found out was because his company was making cuts and canceled all corporate cards that morning. The restaurant fell silent when Marcus said those words. Our mother's fork clattered against her plate. Our aunt stopped mid-bite. Even the server hovering nearby with the wine bottle froze. But I didn't cry or argue. I simply picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and smiled at him. That smile seemed to unsettle him more than any tears could have. He shifted in his seat, loosened his tie, and continued his performance for our family audience, describing his recent promotion to senior vice president at Davidson Financial Group, the corner office with city views, his assistant who managed his impossible schedule. Each word was a carefully placed knife, and he knew exactly where to aim. I watched him perform, noting details I'd store away. The way his phone buzzed constantly and he'd glance at the screen with a secretive smile. How he mentioned his wife Rebecca was visiting her sister for the 3rd weekend in a row. The barely concealed scratch marks on his neck that he'd tried to cover with foundation. His left hand fidgeting with his wedding ring, spinning it around his finger like it was a foreign object. I'd spent 12 years in human resources before my layoff. I knew the signs of a man keeping secrets. What Marcus didn't know was that my failure had come with a substantial severance package and 3 months of outplacement services. But I let him believe his narrative. The lunch ended with Marcus insisting on paying, making a grand show of his platinum corporate American Express card. "Don't worry about it, Bella," he said, using the childhood nickname he knew I hated. "Some of us are in a position to help family." Our mother looked uncomfortable, finally speaking up to say that perhaps we should all contribute, but Marcus waved her off. "Mom, I've got it. Let Isabella save her money. She's going to need it." The other diners at nearby tables had certainly heard every word. My face burned with humiliation, but I maintained that calm smile and thanked him sweetly. As we left, he pulled me aside in the parking lot, lowered his voice, and said, "Maybe this is the wake-up call you needed. You were always the one with potential, and you wasted it. I tried to get you an interview at Davidson last year, remember? But you said you were happy where you were. Well, look where that got you." Then he climbed into his new BMW 7 Series, the one he'd mentioned cost $90,000, and drove away. I drove home to my modest apartment in Queens, the one I'd been renting for 8 years while Marcus and Rebecca lived in their brownstone in Park Slope, with the renovated kitchen and rooftop garden. I'd been to their home exactly twice in the 5 years since they'd bought it. Rebecca had given me tours both times, her voice tight as she showed me the guest room they never used, the basement gym equipment Marcus never touched, the wine cellar he'd insisted they needed. Even then, I'd sensed the cracks in their perfect facade. The way Rebecca's smile never quite reached her eyes when she talked about her husband, how she'd pause mid-sentence when his phone rang and he'd leave the room to answer. But that night after the lunch, I pushed those observations aside and focused on my own situation. My laptop sat on the kitchen counter, inbox filled with job rejection emails. 3 months of severance would run out eventually. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I had wasted my potential. 2 weeks later, I was reviewing my resume for the 14th time when someone knocked on my apartment door at exactly 11:07 p.m. I checked the peephole and saw Rebecca standing in the hallway, 2 large suitcases beside her. Mascara streaked down her face. I opened the door immediately. She collapsed into my arms before I could say anything, her whole body shaking with sobs. I guided her inside, helped her to the couch, and went to make tea while she tried to compose herself. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, she was staring at her phone, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry to show up like this," she finally managed. "I didn't know where else to go. My parents are in Florida. My sister is on a work trip in Singapore, and all our friends are really Marcus's friends from work." She told me everything. That morning, Marcus had come home early, unusually flustered. He'd told her there were going to be significant layoffs at Davidson Financial Group due to the merger with another firm. As part of cost-cutting measures, they were immediately canceling all corporate cards and conducting audits of expense reports from the past year. He'd been uncharacteristically nervous, pacing their living room, checking his phone compulsively. She'd asked him what was wrong, and he'd snapped at her, saying she wouldn't understand the pressure he was under. After he'd left for an emergency meeting, she'd gone to their home office to organize some paperwork and found an envelope that had arrived that morning from American Express Corporate Services. Inside was a statement for Marcus's corporate card. She'd opened it out of curiosity, thinking maybe there was an error they needed to address. The charges told a story that destroyed her marriage in a single afternoon. 8 months of recurring payments to a luxury apartment complex in Manhattan, $500 in monthly parking fees at that same address, regular charges at Victoria's Secret, Sephora, and upscale restaurants she'd never been to, fresh flowers delivered twice weekly to an address that wasn't their home, a weekend trip to the Hamptons she'd never taken, spa treatments she'd never received, jewelry from Tiffany she'd never worn. The statement total for those 8 months was over $60,000. Rebecca had called the apartment complex, pretending to be confirming her husband's lease renewal. The leasing agent had cheerfully told her that Mr. Hayes had been such a wonderful tenant for his girlfriend, always paying on time, and they hoped the couple would stay another year. The girlfriend's name was Lauren Torres. Rebecca found her on Instagram within minutes, a 26-year-old marketing coordinator who worked in Davidson Financial Group's advertising department. Her feed was filled with photos of brunches at expensive restaurants, designer handbags, weekend trips, all of which now made sickening sense. In several photos, Rebecca could see Marcus's distinctive watch in the edge of the frame, his hand on Lauren's waist, the back of his head as he kissed her neck. She'd confronted him when he'd returned home that evening. He'd denied it at first, then minimized it, then finally admitted everything when she'd thrown the credit card statement at him. He'd tried to explain that it meant nothing, that Lauren was just a stress relief from the pressures of his job, that Rebecca was the one he truly loved. When she'd told him she wanted a divorce, he'd laughed. Actually laughed. He'd told her to think carefully about what she was doing, reminding her that she'd signed a prenuptial agreement and that she had no career of her own after giving it up to support his. He'd said she should be grateful for the lifestyle he'd provided, and that plenty of women would overlook a few indiscretions for what he could offer. When she'd started crying, he'd rolled his eyes and told her she was being dramatic. Then he'd packed a bag and left, saying he'd be staying at a friend's place until she calmed down and could discuss this rationally. I listened to all of this, my tea growing cold in my hands. When she finished, she looked at me with red, swollen eyes and asked if she could stay with me for a few days while she figured things out. Of course, I said yes. As she settled into my small guest room, I sat alone in my living room, processing everything she'd told me. Marcus had humiliated me publicly 2 weeks ago, had made me feel worthless and small, all while he was stealing from his company to fund an affair. The hypocrisy was staggering. But more than that, I saw an opportunity forming in my mind, pieces of a puzzle clicking together. I had 3 months of severance left. I had nothing but time, and I had information that Marcus desperately wanted to keep hidden. The next morning, I made breakfast while Rebecca slept in. When she finally emerged around 10, looking exhausted but slightly more composed, I had coffee and pancakes waiting. We sat at my small kitchen table, and I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she'd already contacted a divorce attorney her college roommate had recommended, a woman named Patricia Hoffman, who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for being ruthless. The consultation was scheduled for the next day, but Rebecca was scared. The prenup she'd signed 7 years ago limited her to only $50,000 and no spousal support if the marriage ended, a document Marcus had presented to her a week before their wedding, claiming it was just a formality his parents insisted on. She'd been so in love, so trusting, that she'd signed without getting her own lawyer to review it. I asked to see the prenup. Rebecca pulled it up on her phone and I read through it carefully, my HR experience kicking in. The document was surprisingly amateurish for someone in Marcus's position. There were several clauses that might be contestable, particularly one that voided the agreement if either party committed fraud or engaged in financial misconduct during the marriage. I pointed this out to Rebecca. Her eyes widened. The corporate card charges, she breathed. He was committing fraud, wasn't he? Using company money for personal expenses? I nodded. Not just fraud. Embezzlement, technically. Those charges are going to come up in the audit Davidson Financial is conducting. And when they do, your prenup becomes invalid. Rebecca started to look hopeful for the first time since arriving at my apartment. Then her expression fell. But Marcus will hide everything. He's always been so careful with money, so controlling about our accounts. He'll move assets before I can touch them. I thought about this for a moment. Rebecca, does Marcus know you're here with me? She shook her head. I told him I was going to my sister's in New Jersey. I haven't responded to any of his calls or texts. Good. Keep it that way. Let him think you've left the city. Let him think you're too devastated to function. Meanwhile, you and I are going to build a case that will make sure he loses everything. Over the next 3 days, Rebecca and I worked systematically through every document, every statement, every piece of evidence we could find. She'd brought her laptop, which contained years of shared financial information. We discovered that Marcus had opened a separate savings account 2 years ago, one Rebecca hadn't known about, where he'd been depositing bonuses and tax returns. The current balance was $240,000. We found emails between Marcus and Lauren going back 11 months, including several where they'd discussed their future together, and Marcus's plans to eventually leave Rebecca once his next promotion came through. In one particularly damning email, Marcus had written, "Once I make executive VP, I'll have enough leverage to negotiate a better exit. She signed the prenup so it won't cost me much. Think of it as a business transaction. We documented everything. Screenshots, printed statements, saved emails to multiple cloud drives." Rebecca met with Patricia Hoffman, who took one look at the evidence and smiled like a shark scenting blood. The attorney explained that the corporate card fraud would likely result in criminal charges once Davidson Financial completed their audit. When that happened, Rebecca could file for divorce under the fraud clause, making the prenup void and entitling her to half of all marital assets, plus significant spousal support given her years out of the workforce. But Patricia suggested waiting until after the criminal investigation was further along. "Let Davidson Financial do the heavy lifting," she'd said. "Once the company presses charges, the divorce becomes much cleaner." During this time, Marcus was leaving increasingly angry voicemails on Rebecca's phone, which she'd let go to voicemail every time. He'd started with apologies, moved to anger, and was now cycling through various stages of manipulation. In one message, he'd actually had the nerve to say, "I ran into Isabella at Mom's birthday lunch the other day. At least she knows family sticks together through hard times. You could learn something from her about loyalty." Rebecca had played that message for me, and we'd both laughed bitterly at the irony. Marcus had no idea his wife was living in my guest room. No idea we were building the case that would destroy him. The Davidson Financial audit moved faster than we'd expected. 3 weeks after Rebecca had shown up at my door, the story broke in the Wall Street Journal. Senior Vice President at Davidson Financial Group under investigation for corporate card fraud. The article detailed how an internal audit had uncovered over $60,000 in fraudulent charges on corporate credit cards, including payments for personal apartments, luxury goods, and entertainment expenses. While the article didn't name Marcus specifically due to the ongoing investigation, everyone in his professional circle would know exactly who they were talking about. Rebecca received a call from Patricia Hoffman that afternoon. "It's time," the attorney said. "File tomorrow morning." The divorce papers were served to Marcus at his office the next day, delivered by a professional process server who ensured multiple colleagues witnessed the moment. The timing was deliberate. Rebecca was suing not just for divorce under the fraud clause, but also for full disclosure of all assets, spousal support, and her portion of his retirement accounts. The papers explicitly referenced the corporate card fraud investigation and included copies of the American Express statements as exhibits. Patricia had also filed a motion to freeze all joint accounts immediately, preventing Marcus from moving or hiding assets. Within hours, Marcus's attorney called requesting an emergency meeting, but Patricia refused. "We'll see them in court," she'd said calmly. The explosion was immediate and spectacular. Marcus called Rebecca's phone 17 times in the first hour after being served. When she didn't answer, he started texting, messages that devolved from attempts at negotiation to threats to desperate pleas. "You don't understand what you're doing," one read. "You're going to ruin both of us." Another said, "I can explain everything if you just talk to me like a rational adult." The final one that evening simply said, "You'll regret this." Rebecca forwarded every message to Patricia Hoffman, building the case further. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been doing research of my own. Using my 3 months of severance time productively, I'd reached out to former colleagues in human resources networks across the city, discreetly asking about Davidson Financial Group's internal policies and recent personnel issues. One former coworker who'd moved to a competitor firm mentioned she'd heard whispers about Davidson's toxic culture, about senior executives who treated corporate resources as personal piggy banks, about an internal investigation that went far beyond just one person's misconduct. I'd also been monitoring LinkedIn, watching as several Davidson Financial employees suddenly updated their profiles and marked themselves as open to opportunities. The company was hemorrhaging talent, and Marcus was at the center of the storm. By the end of that week, Marcus had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. His assistant, a competent woman named Jennifer, who'd worked for him for 3 years, had been reassigned to another executive. I knew this because Jennifer had actually reached out to me through LinkedIn after seeing my profile. She'd heard I was job searching and mentioned that her new boss was looking for an HR manager. We'd scheduled a coffee meeting, and during that conversation, she'd carefully avoided naming Marcus directly, but had made it clear that her former supervisor's downfall was the talk of the entire company. "Let's just say," she'd told me, stirring her latte, "that when someone thinks the rules don't apply to them, they usually get sloppy in more ways than one. The corporate card thing was just the beginning of what they're finding." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" Jennifer had glanced around the coffee shop before leaning in. "Expense reports that don't match actual business trips. Client entertainment charges for restaurants that don't exist. Mileage reimbursements for a car he never drove for work." Once they started digging, they found a pattern going back 3 years. "We're talking close to $200,000 in fraudulent claims." She'd paused. "The CFO is furious because this is going to trigger a complete audit of the entire executive team, and the board is already talking about replacing leadership. Your brother really didn't just hurt himself. He's brought down scrutiny on everyone. I thanked Jennifer for the information and the job lead. And we'd exchanged numbers. She'd texted me later that week to say her new boss wanted to schedule an interview with me. The position was HR director, a step up from my previous role, with a salary 20% higher than what I'd been making. The interview went exceptionally well. I'd spent my severance time updating certifications, taking online courses in compliance and employment law, and preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. They'd made me an offer within a week. I was starting in 2 weeks, with full benefits and a signing bonus that covered my rent for 6 months. Meanwhile, Marcus's life was disintegrating day by day. The story had spread beyond the Wall Street Journal to local business publications, and even made a brief mention in the New York Post with the headline, "High-Flying Exec's Corporate Card Catastrophe." His professional reputation was shredded. Former colleagues who'd once envied his success were now distancing themselves, removing endorsements from his LinkedIn profile, untagging themselves from professional photos with him. His network was evaporating. Rebecca had moved past crying and into cold determination. She'd gotten a job herself, a part-time position at an art gallery owned by a friend from college. It wasn't glamorous, but it was income, and it demonstrated to the court that she was building independence. Patricia Hoffman was building an airtight case, documenting not just the affair and fraud, but years of financial control and emotional manipulation. The preliminary divorce hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after Rebecca had filed. In the meantime, Marcus had been forced to move out of the Park Slope brownstone, which was in both their names. He'd taken up residence in a barely furnished studio apartment in a far less desirable neighborhood, a dramatic downgrade from his previous lifestyle. Lauren Torres had broken up with him, according to Rebecca's investigation through mutual acquaintances. The young woman had quickly realized that dating a disgraced executive under criminal investigation wasn't the fairy tale romance she'd imagined. She'd blocked Marcus on all platforms and was reportedly job hunting outside of Davidson Financial, trying to escape the scandal's shadow. Our mother called me during this time, her voice strained with confusion and pain. "Isabella, what's happening with your brother? He won't return my calls, and Rebecca won't speak to me either. All I know is what I'm reading online, and it can't all be true, can it?" I'd been dreading this conversation. "Mom, it's all true. Marcus used his corporate credit card to pay for his mistress's apartment for 8 months. He committed fraud, embezzled from his company, and when Rebecca found out and asked for a divorce, he told her she should be grateful for the lifestyle he provided and overlook his few indiscretions." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. Finally, she'd whispered, "Oh my God, my son. What did we do wrong?" "You didn't do anything wrong, Mom. Marcus made his own choices. He chose to cheat, to steal, to humiliate his wife and his sister. This is on him." My mother had started crying then, apologizing for the lunch, for not stopping Marcus when he'd degraded me in public, for not seeing who her son had become. I'd assured her it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known the extent of his deception. But privately, I'd felt a grim satisfaction. Marcus had spent years building a perfect image, and watching it crumble was vindicating in ways I hadn't expected. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold morning in late October. Rebecca wore a simple navy suit, her hair pulled back, minimal makeup. She looked composed and professional. Marcus arrived separately with his attorney, an overpriced lawyer named Richard Brennan, who specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Marcus looked terrible. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit hanging loose on his frame. His hair was unkempt, dark circles under his eyes. When he saw Rebecca, he'd actually tried to approach her, but Patricia Hoffman had stepped between them immediately. "No contact, Mr. Hayes. Per the restraining order your wife filed last week." My jaw had dropped. Rebecca hadn't mentioned a restraining order. Later, Rebecca explained that Marcus had shown up drunk at the art gallery where she worked, causing a scene and demanding she drop the divorce. The gallery owner had called the police, and Patricia had immediately filed for protection. The restraining order required Marcus to stay at least 500 feet away from Rebecca, her workplace, and my apartment. He was unraveling completely, and it was only going to get worse. The judge at the preliminary hearing had reviewed the evidence, including the corporate card statements, the emails between Marcus and Lauren, and the documentation of the hidden savings account. He'd ruled that the prenuptial agreement was invalid due to fraud, that all marital assets would be frozen pending full discovery, and that Marcus would be required to pay temporary spousal support of $4,000 per month until the final divorce decree. Marcus's attorney had objected strenuously, arguing that his client was currently without income and couldn't afford such payments. The judge had looked at Richard Brennan with barely concealed disdain. "Your client spent $60,000 of his employer's money on his mistress. I'm quite certain he can find $4,000 a month for his wife. If he'd managed his resources more ethically, we wouldn't be here." Motion granted. Marcus had gone pale, then red, his hands clenching into fists on the table. Rebecca had maintained her composure throughout, only allowing herself a small smile once we'd left the courtroom. That evening, I'd taken Rebecca out to dinner at a modest Italian restaurant in our neighborhood. She'd ordered wine for the first time since moving in, and we'd toasted to new beginnings. "I can't believe how fast everything has happened," she'd said, twirling pasta on her fork. "3 weeks ago, I thought my life was over. Now I feel like I'm finally waking up from a bad dream." I'd smiled at her. "You're stronger than you knew. Marcus counted on you being too scared to fight back. He miscalculated." Rebecca had reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "I couldn't have done this without you, Isabella. You gave me a safe place, helped me see clearly, connected me with Patricia. You saved me." I'd squeezed back. "You saved yourself. I just provided the guest room and moral support." But privately, I knew my role had been more than that. Every piece of evidence we'd compiled, every strategic decision about timing, every choice to let Marcus keep digging his own grave, those had been deliberate. I'd learned during my years in human resources that the best way to handle a bully wasn't confrontation. It was documentation. Let them expose themselves. Give them enough rope, and they'd hang themselves every time. Marcus had spent his entire adult life believing he was smarter than everyone else, untouchable because of his position and charm. He'd never imagined that his younger sister, the failure he'd mocked publicly, would be the architect of his downfall. The Davidson financial investigation concluded 6 weeks later. The findings were damning. Marcus had submitted fraudulent expense reports totaling $197,000 over 3 years. The corporate card charges were just the most recent and blatant example of a pattern of theft. The company's board voted unanimously to press criminal charges. Marcus was arrested at his studio apartment on a Thursday morning, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and grand larceny. The bail was set at $500,000. His parents, devastated and ashamed, had refused to post it. Marcus spent 3 days in jail before his attorney managed to negotiate a lower bail using the hidden savings account Rebecca's divorce attorney had already frozen. The judge allowed it only because Marcus literally had no other assets available. The criminal trial was scheduled for 6 months out, but Marcus's attorney was already pushing for a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, and taking it to trial would only result in a harsher sentence. The prosecutor was offering 5 years in prison with 3 years of supervised probation if Marcus pled guilty and agreed to full restitution. Richard Brennan was advising him to take it, knowing that a trial could result in 15 years or more. Marcus was trapped, and everyone knew it. His career was destroyed. His marriage was over. His reputation was ruined. The life he'd built on arrogance and theft had collapsed completely. Rebecca's divorce proceeded smoothly after the criminal charges were filed. Patricia Hoffman had leveraged the criminal case to negotiate a settlement that gave Rebecca everything she'd asked for and more. Half of all marital assets, including the Park Slope brownstone, Marcus's retirement accounts, and the hidden savings account. 3 years of spousal support at $6,000 per month. Marcus would keep only his personal possessions and his mounting legal debts. He'd signed the settlement agreement in his attorney's office, reportedly without saying a word, his hand shaking as he initialed each page. The divorce was finalized in early December, less than 3 months after Rebecca had shown up at my apartment with 2 suitcases. During those months, I'd settled into my new position at my new company. The work was challenging and engaging, everything my previous job had been before the layoffs. My new colleagues respected my expertise, and my boss had already mentioned that a promotion to Vice President of Human Resources was likely within 18 months if I continued performing well. I'd moved out of my small apartment in Queens and into a larger 1-bedroom in a better neighborhood, with natural light and updated appliances and a sense of home I hadn't felt in years. Rebecca had used her divorce settlement to purchase a smaller but charming condo in Brooklyn, enrolled in graduate school to finish the art history degree she'd abandoned when she married Marcus, and was dating again, cautiously but with optimism. We'd become genuinely close during her time staying with me, our relationship evolving from distant sisters-in-law to real friends. She'd apologized repeatedly for Marcus's behavior, for not standing up to him when he'd humiliated me at our mother's birthday lunch, for not seeing sooner what kind of man she'd married. I'd told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she'd been as much a victim of Marcus's manipulation as anyone. We'd started a tradition of Sunday brunch at different restaurants around the city, trying new places and catching up on our weeks. It was during one of these brunches in January that Rebecca told me she'd run into Lauren Torres at a coffee shop in Manhattan. She looked terrible, Rebecca said, cutting into her omelet. Exhausted, stressed. She actually came up to me and apologized. Said she never meant to destroy a marriage, that Marcus had told her he was separated, and that the divorce was already in progress when they'd started dating. She'd believed him completely. I'd raised my eyebrows. And you believed her? Rebecca had shrugged. Actually, yes. She was too genuinely upset to be lying. She told me that Marcus had promised her everything, that he'd leave his wife, that they'd get married, that he'd take care of her. She'd given up opportunities at other companies to stay at Davidson Financial, thinking she had a future there. Then when everything imploded, she realized she'd been just another pawn in his games. She's working at a startup now, making half what she made before, trying to rebuild her career. I'd considered this. Did you tell her about the criminal charges? Rebecca had nodded. She knew. She's actually been subpoenaed as a witness. The prosecution wants her testimony about the gifts and the apartment to establish that Marcus knew the corporate card charges were personal, not business-related. She's terrified of having to testify, of having her name in the media attached to this scandal. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Lauren Torres had participated in an affair with a married man, had accepted expensive gifts and accommodations without questioning where the money came from, had believed convenient lies because they suited her. She wasn't innocent. But she also hadn't deserved to have her entire career derailed by Marcus's selfishness and fraud. The criminal trial never happened. In late February, Marcus accepted the plea deal. He pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud, was sentenced to 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3, and was ordered to pay full restitution to Davidson Financial Group. The company had already written off the losses and moved on, but the court order meant that any money Marcus earned for the rest of his life would be garnished until the debt was satisfied. He'd also been disbarred from working in financial services, permanently banned from holding any position of financial trust or authority. When he was released from prison, he'd be starting over from nothing, middle-aged with a criminal record and no marketable skills for his former career. Our mother attended the sentencing hearing. She'd aged visibly over the past 6 months, the stress and shame taking their toll. Afterward, she'd met me for coffee, her hands shaking as she held the cup. "I keep thinking about that lunch," she'd said quietly. "The way he talked to you, the way he acted like he was so much better than everyone. How did I not see it? How did I raise someone capable of this?" I'd taken her hand. "Mom, Marcus made his choices. You taught him right from wrong. He chose wrong, repeatedly, and now he's facing the consequences. That's not on you." She'd cried then, and I'd let her, holding her hand across the small table in the coffee shop, while other patrons politely pretended not to notice. She'd asked if I'd go with her to visit Marcus in prison. I'd refused gently but firmly. "I can't do that, Mom. He humiliated me, called me a failure in front of our whole family, and never once apologized. Then I found out he'd been committing crimes while looking down on everyone else. I don't have anything to say to him." My mother had accepted this, though I could see the pain in her eyes. She'd visit him alone, once a month, sitting across from her son in a prison visiting room and trying to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. I'd wished her strength but held firm to my boundary. Marcus had made his bed. He could lie in it alone. Spring arrived with cherry blossoms and longer days. Rebecca graduated from her first semester of graduate school with straight A's, finally pursuing the education she'd always wanted. My promotion came through ahead of schedule, making me the youngest vice president of human resources in my company's history. I'd started seeing someone, a kind environmental lawyer I'd met through work, who made me laugh and never once asked about my brother's scandal. Life was moving forward, surprisingly bright after such a dark period. I'd taken the humiliation Marcus had heaped on me and transformed it into motivation, had used my unexpected free time during unemployment to better myself, had helped Rebecca escape an abusive marriage, and had watched as karma delivered justice more thoroughly than I ever could have planned. One Saturday morning in April, I was grocery shopping when I saw a familiar face in the produce section. Jennifer, Marcus's former assistant, was examining avocados. She'd seen me at the same moment and had waved, coming over with a smile. We'd chatted about work, about the weather, about nothing important. Then she'd hesitated before saying, "I never properly thanked you, you know, for what you did." I'd been confused. "What do you mean?" Jennifer had glanced around before speaking quietly. "After everything came out about Marcus, HR did an internal review of his entire department. They found out he'd been taking credit for my work, claiming projects I'd completed as his own, blocking my attempts to transfer to other departments because he didn't want to lose what he called competent support staff. His downfall freed me. I got promoted to project manager, something he'd prevented for 2 years. So thank you, even if it wasn't intentional, for helping bring him down." I'd been startled to realize how many people Marcus had hurt, how his selfishness and fraud had rippled out beyond his marriage and family. "I'm glad something good came out of this mess," I'd told her sincerely. We'd exchanged another few pleasantries before parting ways, but her words had stayed with me. Marcus hadn't just betrayed his wife and stolen from his company. He'd been systematically harmful to everyone in his orbit, taking credit, blocking opportunities, using people as stepping stones for his own advancement. His downfall hadn't just been justice for Rebecca and me. It had been justice for dozens of people who'd suffered under his narcissism and greed. That evening, I'd met Rebecca for our Sunday brunch tradition, even though it was Saturday, because she'd wanted to celebrate submitting her final paper for the semester. We'd gone to a rooftop restaurant in Williamsburg, ordered champagne and oysters, and watched the sunset over Manhattan, "Do you ever think about him?" Rebecca had asked suddenly. I'd known she meant Marcus. "Sometimes," I'd admitted. "Usually when something good happens, I think about how he'd react to knowing I'm doing well, that I'm thriving actually, that everything he said at that lunch was wrong." Rebecca had nodded. "I think about him too, about how he's sitting in a cell right now, probably still believing he's the victim, that everyone else is to blame for his choices. But mostly, I just feel relieved that I'm free." We'd clinked our champagne glasses together, toasting to freedom, to new beginnings, to lives rebuilt from the ashes of Marcus's destruction. Below us, the city lights were starting to come on, thousands of windows glowing in the dusk. Somewhere out there, Marcus was in prison, his reputation destroyed, his career over, his marriage dissolved, his future bleak. He'd lost everything because he'd believed himself untouchable, had thought the rules didn't apply to him, had assumed his younger sister was too much of a failure to matter. That assumption had been his biggest mistake. I'd mattered very much, as it turned out, just not in the way he'd ever expected. 3 years later, I stood in my corner office on the 32nd floor, Vice President of Human Resources with a team of 15 people reporting to me. The view stretched across Manhattan, similar to the one Marcus used to brag about having at Davidson Financial. My assistant knocked and entered with my afternoon schedule. "Your 2 p.m. with the Columbia Business School panel confirmed," she said. "They're excited to have you speak about ethical leadership in corporate culture." I'd thanked her, turning back to the window. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca was getting remarried next month to a documentary filmmaker she'd met at an art gallery opening. Her graduate thesis on women artists in the 1960s had been selected for publication. She'd sold the Park Slope brownstone for well above market value and purchased a beautiful apartment uptown, where she and her fiancé were building a life based on respect and partnership, everything her first marriage hadn't been. She'd invited our mother to the wedding, but had made it clear that any discussion of Marcus was off limits. This was about her future, not her past. Marcus had been released from prison 6 months early for good behavior. Our mother had mentioned this during a recent phone call, her voice careful, testing my reaction. He was living in a halfway house in New Jersey, working as a night clerk at a budget hotel, his wages garnished to pay his restitution debt. He'd written letters to Rebecca, to our mother, even to me, claiming he'd found redemption, that prison had changed him, that he understood now how much damage he'd caused. None of us had responded. Redemption required not just acknowledgement, but amends, and Marcus had nothing left to offer as restitution except empty words. I'd heard through my professional network that he'd tried to apply for positions in finance under an assumed work history, claiming the gap in his resume was due to caring for a sick relative. Every company that ran a background check discovered the truth within hours. He was unhireable in the field he'd once dominated, his expertise worthless because no one would trust him with anything of value. He'd destroyed his own future far more effectively than any external punishment could have. He'd become the failure he'd once accused me of being. Except I'd rebuilt while he remained trapped in the consequences of his choices. The criminal restitution order meant he'd be paying Davidson Financial for the next 30 years at minimum, his wages perpetually garnished, unable to accumulate savings or rebuild wealth. The divorce settlement meant he'd lost everything he'd built during his marriage. His professional network had evaporated, his reputation permanently tarnished, his name synonymous with corporate fraud in certain circles. Google his name, and the first 10 results were articles about his crimes. He'd never escape it. Every job application, every attempt to move forward would be haunted by his past. Our mother had asked me once if I felt vindicated. I'd thought about it before answering honestly. "No," I'd said. "Vindication implies I needed external validation that I wasn't a failure. I don't need that anymore. I know my worth, and Marcus's opinion of me was always irrelevant. What I feel is peace. He can't hurt anyone else now. He can't humiliate his wife, steal from his employer, or look down on family members while secretly being a criminal. That's not vindication. That's just justice." My mother had been quiet for a long moment before saying, "You're stronger than both your father and me. We're proud of you, Isabella." My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Found my wedding dress. Lunch tomorrow to show you photos?" I'd smiled, typing back an enthusiastic yes. Tomorrow I'd admire wedding dresses and help plan a celebration of love that wasn't built on lies and control. Next week I'd deliver that lecture on ethical leadership at Columbia, sharing sanitized versions of lessons learned from watching a narcissist's downfall. Next month I'd dance at Rebecca's wedding, celebrating her second chance at happiness. Next year, who knew? Maybe a promotion to Chief Human Resources Officer. Maybe a serious relationship with someone who saw me as an equal partner. Maybe just continued peace and success in a life I'd built on my own terms. The sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in New Jersey, Marcus was probably putting on a polyester uniform shirt, getting ready for another night shift at a budget hotel, checking in travelers who'd never know the man handing them keycards had once driven a $90,000 BMW, and sneered at his sister for being a failure. The cosmic balance had shifted entirely. I'd been knocked down, humiliated publicly, and had emerged stronger. He'd been at the top, arrogant and cruel, and had fallen further than anyone could have predicted. I didn't forgive him. I didn't need to. Forgiveness implied he'd earned it through genuine change and amends, neither of which he'd demonstrated. His letters remained unread, his attempts at reconciliation ignored. He'd made his choices at that birthday lunch when he'd decided to humiliate me for entertainment, when he'd flaunted his success while hiding his crimes, when he'd treated his wife as property and his sister as beneath him. Those choices had consequences, and he was living them every single day. That was enough. I didn't need his downfall to complete me. I was already complete, successful, at peace. His suffering wasn't my victory. My thriving was. As I gathered my things to leave the office, my assistant stopped me with a package. "This came for you this afternoon. Personal delivery." I'd opened it curiously, finding a handwritten card from Lauren Torres. "I saw your name in the business journal," it read. "Congratulations on your success. I wanted you to know that I've rebuilt my career too, at a startup focused on financial transparency and corporate ethics. Funny how life works. Thank you for being part of the chain of events that forced me to reevaluate everything. I'm in a much better place now. I hope you are too." I'd smiled, tucking the card into my bag. Another person Marcus had hurt who'd managed to transform damage into growth. The elevator descended from my office toward the lobby, and I'd thought about that lunch 3 years ago. How small I'd felt, how powerless, how humiliated, how Marcus's laughter had echoed in my ears for days, his words cutting deeper than he'd probably intended, how I'd driven home that day wondering if maybe he was right, if maybe I was a failure, if maybe I'd wasted my potential. That version of me felt like a different person now. Someone young and uncertain and too willing to accept other people's definitions of success and failure. I'd grown past her, evolved beyond the need for external validation or family approval. Marcus had taught me an unintentional lesson at that lunch. People who need to publicly humiliate others are usually hiding their own deep insecurities and failures. People who flaunt their success are often compensating for internal emptiness. People who step on others to feel tall are actually very small inside. He'd been projecting his own fears onto me, had been so terrified of his own impending downfall that he'd lashed out at an easy target. I'd just been convenient, present, and in his mind, beneath him. He'd been wrong about that last part. I'd never been beneath him. I'd simply been standing at a different place in my journey, and his position had been built on sand and fraud and borrowed time. The hotel where Marcus now worked was nowhere near my neighborhood, and I had no intention of ever going there. But I'd heard from Rebecca, who'd heard from our mother, that he'd actually seen me once. He'd been riding the subway to work, still in his hotel uniform, and had spotted me across the platform at a transfer station. I'd been in a business suit, carrying a leather briefcase, talking on my phone about a contract negotiation. He'd frozen, watching me, and our eyes had met for just a moment before the train arrived and I'd boarded without acknowledgement. Our mother said he'd come home and cried that night, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd lost and what I'd gained. I felt nothing about that story when I'd heard it. Not satisfaction, not pity, not anger, just a distant sense that justice had completed its work. He'd seen evidence that his cruelest predictions had been wrong, that I'd thrived in his absence, that my life was fuller and richer than his could ever be again. That was fitting. That was enough. I didn't need his tears or his recognition or his belated understanding. I had my corner office and my team and my success and my peace. Those were mine, earned through my own work and resilience, untainted by his opinion or his presence. Rebecca's wedding was everything her first one hadn't been. Intimate, joyful, filled with genuine love and celebration. Her new husband looked at her like she hung the moon, treated her like an equal partner, celebrated her achievements without needing to compete. During the reception, Rebecca had pulled me aside, her eyes bright with happy tears. "You gave me the courage to leave," she'd said. "Watching you rebuild after Marcus tried to destroy you, seeing you refuse to accept his narrative about who you were, that showed me I could do the same. Thank you for being stronger than I was." I'd hugged her tightly. "You were always strong. You just needed permission to show it." Our mother had attended the wedding, walking Rebecca down the aisle since Rebecca's father had passed years before. She'd smiled throughout the ceremony, but I'd seen the sadness behind her eyes, the missing piece where her son should have been. Marcus hadn't been invited. Rebecca had been clear that including him would taint her special day with reminders of pain and betrayal. Our mother had understood, even if it hurt. Some wounds were too deep, some betrayals too profound. Family wasn't an obligation to maintain connection regardless of behavior. Family was something you chose, something you built with people who loved and respected you. Marcus had forfeited his place in that family 3 years ago when he'd chosen cruelty over kindness. The wedding toast I gave focused on resilience, on finding strength in unexpected places, on the family we create versus the family we're born into. I'd talked about watching Rebecca transform from someone trapped in fear to someone radiating confidence and joy. I'd mentioned, without naming him, how sometimes the worst things that happen to us become catalysts for the best changes in our lives. People had applauded, several wiping away tears. Rebecca had mouthed, "Thank you," across the reception hall. Her new husband had wrapped his arm around her waist, and they'd looked at each other with such genuine affection that my heart had felt full watching them. That night, after the reception ended and guests had departed, I'd stood alone on the hotel balcony where the wedding had been held, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere in those lights, Marcus existed, working his night shift or sleeping in his halfway house, living a life so diminished from what he'd had that it must feel like a prison even outside of one. I'd tried to summon some feeling about that. Satisfaction, pity, vindication, anything, but there was nothing. He was simply irrelevant now, a footnote in my story rather than a central character. The space he'd occupied in my thoughts had been filled with better things: career success, genuine friendships, family bonds with people who deserved that title, peace. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of late-blooming flowers from the hotel garden. Inside, I could hear the cleanup crew breaking down tables, the distant laughter of remaining guests in the bar. My phone buzzed with a message from my boyfriend. "How was the wedding? Want company when you get back tomorrow?" And I'd smiled, typing back that the wedding was beautiful and yes, dinner tomorrow would be perfect. This was my life now. Simple joys, genuine connections, work I found meaningful, love I didn't have to beg for or justify deserving. Everything Marcus had said I'd never have because I was a failure. The ultimate revenge wasn't his downfall, though that had been satisfying to watch. The ultimate revenge was my absolute indifference to his existence. He couldn't hurt me anymore because I'd stopped giving him power over my self-perception. He'd called me a failure at that lunch, and for a brief moment, I'd believed him. That belief had died somewhere between filing Rebecca's divorce papers and accepting my promotion. I'd realized that success wasn't measured by salary or job title, or the ability to pay a $400 lunch bill. Success was living authentically, treating people with respect, building a life you're proud of without stepping on others to get there. By those metrics, I'd always been successful, and Marcus never had been. He'd built his life on lies and theft and cruelty, on a hollow image that crumbled the moment it was examined. I'd built mine on integrity and resilience and genuine relationships. When the storms came, and they'd come for both of us, my foundation had held while his had washed away completely. That wasn't luck or karma or divine intervention. That was simply the natural consequence of how we'd each chosen to live. He'd chosen shortcuts and selfishness. I'd chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. 3 years later, the results were irrefutable. I'd turned away from the balcony, heading back inside to find Rebecca and congratulate her one more time before heading to my hotel room. Tomorrow, I'd fly back to New York, back to my corner office and my team and my life. Next week, I'd barely remember this moment of reflection, too busy with meetings and projects and the forward motion of a thriving career. Marcus would still be checking in guests at a budget hotel, still paying restitution, still living in the ruins of the empire he'd built on sand. Our paths would never cross again, not really. We existed in entirely different worlds now, and that was exactly as it should be. He'd taught me what not to become. I'd shown him what he'd never be again. The lesson was complete, the book was closed, and I was finally, thoroughly, completely free.